the moment my own daughter looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome at her wedding. I felt something inside me break. I had raised her, carried her through sleepless nights, worked 2 jobs to pay for her college, and still, in the end, I was treated like an inconvenience. She told me it would be better if I stayed home, that she didn't want to deal with me on her special day. I stood there, silent, with her words echoing in my chest like a cruel verdict. After everything I had given, I was being erased. I wish I could tell you I shouted, or that I demanded respect, but in that moment, I simply froze. My heart felt heavy, as if all the years of sacrifice had been for nothing. It wasn't just about missing one day, it was the realization that, in her eyes, I had become disposable. I wasn't the mother who had guided her into adulthood. I was just a shadow she wanted to push aside. I remember standing in the kitchen afterward, holding onto the counter for balance. My body felt weak, but it was my spirit that had taken the real blow. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. It cuts deepest when it's from your own blood. I had never imagined my life would lead here, to being dismissed by the very person I loved most. It's strange how quickly one sentence can make you reevaluate an entire lifetime. I thought of the nights I stayed up sewing her prom dress, the mornings I walked her to the bus stop, the sacrifices I never counted as losses because they were for her. And yet, in her mind, I was no longer someone to honor, I was someone to avoid. That was the moment I realized my story wasn't about what I had lost. It was about how I had lived, and how everything began to change when I stopped accepting invisibility. But before I can tell you how I rose from that moment, I need to take you back to the life I lived before the betrayal and the love that made the pain so sharp. When I think back to the life I lived before everything fell apart, what comes to me first isn't the arguments or disappointments, it's the simple moments of love that defined who I was. My life had never been glamorous, but it was filled with devotion. I worked long hours, often taking on extra shifts, so my children could have the things I never did. I remember packing lunches before dawn, tucking little notes inside with hearts drawn in the corner, because I wanted them to feel loved even in the middle of an ordinary school day. There were years when money was tight, when I quietly skipped buying myself new shoes so I could make sure my daughter had the right dress for her school dance. I still remember the way her face lit up when she twirled in front of the mirror. It made every sacrifice worth it. Even the nights when I came home exhausted, I made sure dinner was on the table, homework was checked, and their world felt safe and steady. That was my mission, to make sure they never felt the instability I had known growing up. Sundays were my favorite. Pancakes on the griddle, music on the radio, and laughter filling the kitchen. Those mornings are etched in my heart: the smell of syrup, the sound of giggles, the sight of my children running through the house with sticky hands. It was chaotic, yes, but it was also pure happiness. I lived for those little moments, the ones that seemed so ordinary at the time, but became precious memories later. And yet, looking back now, I realize how much of myself I gave away without question. My time, my energy, my dreams, I set them aside, believing that love was about giving endlessly. I thought if I poured everything I had into my family, they would always carry me with them in gratitude. I never imagined a day would come when that devotion would be seen as weakness, when my sacrifices would be forgotten like yesterday's news. What hurts most isn't the betrayal itself, but the contrast. I gave them the warmth of a home, the security of sacrifice, the constancy of love, and now I find myself met with coldness, indifference, and the sense that I am a burden. That sharp contrast makes every memory ache a little more. How did something so beautiful turn into something so painful? I suppose that's the part I need to explain next, because the shift didn't happen overnight. There was a moment, subtle at first, when the kindness I had known began to fade. When the first crack appeared in the family I thought was unbreakable. That was the beginning of everything that followed the first blow, that showed me how quickly love can turn cruel. The first real blow came not with shouting, but with something colder dismissal. I began to notice how I was no longer included in decisions, even ones that involved my own home. My daughter and her husband would speak over me, brushing aside my thoughts as if I were a child who couldn't understand. At first, I told myself it was stress, that they were simply preoccupied. But the pattern became undeniable. I wasn't being consulted anymore. I was being managed. It stung most at gatherings. I would sit quietly at the table, listening, waiting for a chance to join the conversation. Yet when I did, my words fell flat, treated like background noise. There were times I caught the quick exchange of glances, the subtle smirk, as though my very presence was more of an inconvenience than a comfort. I remember bringing a pie I had baked, still warm from the oven, placing it proudly on the table among the catered dishes. No one touched it. They reached instead for the glossy desserts from downtown bakeries, and I sat there, hands folded, pretending I wasn't hurt. The comments grew sharper with time. Little reminders that I was slowing down, that I wasn't keeping up. Suggestions that I think about downsizing, that maybe it was too much for me to handle on my own. I tried to swallow the words, to remind myself they meant well. But the mask slipped one evening when my daughter told me, in a voice as calm as it was cruel, that perhaps I was better off finding somewhere else to live, somewhere where people my age belonged. It was said so casually, as though she were offering practical advice. But to me, it landed like a stone. In that moment, I felt stripped of everything I had built, my years of sacrifice, my role as a mother, all reduced to being useless. I carried that word with me, heavy and unshakable. It whispered in my ear when I lay awake at night, asking myself how love could turn into rejection so quickly. But deep down, even through the hurt, something unsettled me. I knew the woman I had raised, and cruelty had never been her nature. I began to wonder if there was more beneath her sudden eagerness to push me out. Something hidden, something I wasn't supposed to see. And as much as the pain cut into me, a new question started to rise. What exactly were they hiding from me? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The push to move me out, the urgency in their voices, the way my daughter's eyes darted when I asked questions, it all felt rehearsed. And so, one morning, instead of lying in bed replaying the cruel words that had been thrown at me, I gathered my strength and went to see an old family lawyer who had once handled our house papers. I walked into his office with trembling hands, not knowing what I would even ask for. But the look on his face when I told him I'd been cut out of everything confirmed what my heart had already suspected. There was more to the story. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents, and slid it across the polished desk. My heart pounded as I opened it. There, in black and white, was the truth. My husband's will. The one I was told didn't exist in my favor. My eyes scanned the words, my breath catching as I read line after line. The house, the very one I was being forced out of, was left to me, not to my daughter. to me. And more than that, the accounts, the savings, nearly everything had been willed to ensure my security for the rest of my life. It didn't make sense at first. Why had she told me otherwise? Why had I been treated like a guest in my own home? But then the ugly realization hit me. She had lied. She had hidden the truth. She had tried to erase me by pretending the papers said something they did not. Anger burned in me, hotter than the grief ever had. I wasn't just unwanted, I was being defrauded. I flipped through the pages, my fingers shaking as I came to a clause that made my breath stop entirely. A condition. A clear line that stated my daughter's share depended on how she treated me after my husband's passing. It was as if he had seen this very betrayal coming. If she dishonored me, if she cast me aside, her inheritance would revert back to me. I sat there, stunned, my mind racing. The cruelty I had endured wasn't just heartless, it was reckless. In her greed, my daughter had not only lost my trust, she had unknowingly cut herself out of everything she thought she had gained. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark inside me, a flicker of power. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't useless. I had the law, the truth, and a husband who had prepared for this moment, even if I hadn't. I left that office walking taller than when I entered. The air outside felt different, lighter somehow, though the battle ahead loomed large, because now I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to crumble quietly. I was going to prepare, step by step, for a fight I never thought I'd have to face. Walking out of that lawyer's office, I felt like I had stepped into a new version of myself. For weeks, I had been carrying shame and heartbreak like a heavy coat, believing I had no control. But now, with the truth in my hands, the weight began to shift. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had been lied to, manipulated, and cast aside, but I had proof. And with proof came leverage. The first step was quiet. I met with the lawyer again in private. We reviewed every line of the will, and I asked questions I had never dared to ask before. I admitted how little I knew about the finances, how much I had let others speak over me. But I also made a promise to myself and to him that those days were over. I was going to understand everything. I was going to protect what was mine. He agreed to represent me, and in that moment, I felt the smallest but most important victory. I wasn't alone anymore. Next, I took stock of what I still had. Hidden in an old biscuit tin were savings I had kept from my teaching years, untouched for decades. It wasn't much compared to what had been stolen from me, but it was mine, enough to cover fees, to give me independence. For the first time, I saw that even my smallest acts of frugality had prepared me for this very storm. I began to plan carefully. I didn't confront my daughter right away. Instead, I let her believe I was still fragile, still blind to what she was doing. I smiled when she talked about helping me downsize. I nodded when she suggested senior housing brochures, all the while I was quietly gathering documents, copies, and records with the help of my lawyer. Every bank statement, every property paper, every scrap of evidence was placed into a folder that became my shield. And there were small victories that kept me going. The day I saw her try to use one of the accounts only to find it frozen, I stayed silent, but inside, I felt a quiet surge of justice. The moment she called me with false concern about financial confusion, I recognized her words not as kindness, but as desperation. She no longer controlled the game. What surprised me most was the change happening inside me. For so long, I had seen myself only as a caregiver, someone who gave and gave until there was nothing left. Now, I was learning to be something else, a protector of myself. Every step I took, every quiet move behind the scenes, rebuilt a piece of the confidence that betrayal had shattered. Still, I knew this couldn't remain in the shadows forever. Sooner or later, there would have to be a confrontation, a moment when I would look into my daughter's eyes and let her see that I knew everything. And as painful as I imagined it would be, I no longer dreaded it. In fact, I began to anticipate it, because for the first time, I would be walking into that moment not as the discarded, powerless mother she believed me to be, but as someone ready to fight, ready to reclaim what was mine, ready to show her the truth. The storm was coming, and I was no longer afraid. The day of the confrontation felt almost ordinary at first, but inside, I carried a calm resolve I had never known before. My daughter called me, her voice trembling, full of forced sweetness as she tried to mask the panic. Something was wrong with the accounts, she said. Payments weren't going through. Bank officials were asking questions. For the first time, I could hear the crack in her confidence, and I didn't rush to comfort her. I simply listened, letting her words spill out like water from a broken pipe. When we met, she arrived with that same polished air she always wore, but it was different now. Her smile was strained, her hands restless, her eyes darting. I sat across from her, steady and composed, watching her dance around her own fear. She began circling questions, pretending concern for me, suggesting maybe I was confused, or perhaps someone had made a clerical mistake. I let her go on just long enough before I stopped her with a single truth I knew. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told her plainly that I was aware of the will, aware of what had been left for me, aware of the lies that had been spun in my name. I could see the color drain from her face, as if every drop of certainty had been pulled out in an instant. She tried to deny it, then to redirect, but nothing worked. I was no longer playing the role she had written for me. For the first time in this twisted story, I wasn't the one shrinking back. I wasn't the invisible mother waiting for scraps of kindness. I was the one with the truth in my hands, and it made her squirm. The silence between us grew heavy, thick enough to feel. She opened her mouth, searching for an excuse, but nothing came. Walking away that day, I didn't feel rage. I felt something deeper, justice in its purest form. She had spent months trying to make me powerless, but in the end, it was her mask that shattered. That confrontation wasn't the final victory, but it was the moment she realized she no longer had control. And yet, even then, I knew there was more hidden beneath the surface. A bigger twist was waiting in the shadows, and I was ready to face it when it came. I thought I had seen it all, the lies, the cruelty, the betrayal, but nothing prepared me for the final twist. My lawyer called me in for one last review of the documents, and as he slid the pages across the table, I realized the depth of my daughter's mistake. My husband had not only protected me in his will, he had included a safeguard so precise it felt almost prophetic. Her entire inheritance wasn't just conditional, it was tied directly to how she treated me. And by casting me aside, by reducing me to nothing more than a burden, she had sealed her own downfall. The moment I understood it fully, I felt a rush of clarity. All the accounts she thought belonged to her, all the investments she boasted about, had already reverted back to me. Every penny, every asset, every piece of property, she had stolen from herself, and I didn't have to lift a finger. When she found out, I saw her face crumble. That false confidence she wore like a crown shattered into dust. For once, she couldn't talk her way out, couldn't manipulate, couldn't gaslight me into believing I was mistaken. The truth was undeniable. It was a strange kind of justice, not loud or violent, but steady and final. She had tried to make me homeless, but instead, she was the one left with nothing. Her greed had written her own punishment. And me, I didn't just gain the house and the accounts. I gained back something far greater, my dignity. For the first time in years, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer powerless. I held the cards, every single one of them. But as satisfying as it was, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. Justice had been served. Yes, but what mattered most was what I would do with it. That reflection, that next step, was waiting for me. Looking back now, I realized that betrayal, as painful as it was, became the very thing that gave me my strength. I would never have chosen this path. I would never have asked to be tested this way. But sometimes life strips you bare, takes everything you thought you could rely on, and forces you to see what you're really made of. I once believed my worth was measured only by what I gave to others: my time, my sacrifices, my love. I thought being a good mother meant disappearing into the background, making myself small so everyone else could shine. But when my own child cast me aside, I discovered a truth I should have known long ago. My value was never dependent on how others treated me. It was already within me, waiting for me to claim it. Justice came in a way I could never have orchestrated on my own. And while it was satisfying to see lies crumble and greed exposed, the greater victory was internal. I regained my voice. I learned to stand tall again. I remembered that even in the darkest nights, dignity is something no one can take from you unless you hand it over willingly. Family, I've learned, is not defined by titles or bloodlines alone. True family is found in those who honor your presence, who protect your heart, who see you not as a burden, but as a blessing. Sometimes those people share your last name, and sometimes they don't. If you've ever felt invisible, discarded, or betrayed by someone you trusted most, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not powerless. You are not useless. You have more strength inside you than you realize. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who might need hope, and leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever experienced betrayal from those closest to you? And how did you find your way forward? Your story matters too.